I don't know if you've ever noticed. I guess I've noticed a change in the last 30, 35 years, maybe 40 years on television. Back from the 60s, and some of you older than me, if you're watching back in the 50s, the type of shows that were being aired, a lot of comedy shows and whatnot. Then we started getting into Bonanza and a few of those shows with a few killings, but they never really showed anything. Nowadays, we tend to live in a culture that in some respects glorifies killing. We have all of our CSIs, NCSI, all the other different television shows that we have, and we glorify in some respects death, and we look at the violence and we sort of lift it up. Just think about any of you that have had or presently have teenage kids, and they like to have all these games, Game Boys, Sega games. I don't even know what's out there nowadays. I know that when my older kids were growing up, of course, the boys, what did they want? They wanted all the shoot-'em-up ones. And as a dad, I did buy them, but it always turned to my stomach when I would watch them shooting, and things would explode, and people would explode, and it's like, what are we doing with this as a culture? It's estimated that kids today, if you have young kids, think about my grandkids now, that by the time they get out of elementary school, they will have seen anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 murders through the media, through TV, watching different shows. I don't know about you, but I know for me that's sort of disheartening. And yet, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself here, so we'll backtrack here. What we're doing, Sherry already mentioned, if you're new today, we're looking at the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments. So far, we've spent 5 weeks looking at the 10 Commandments. I'd like you to read with me, not the part that's in yellow, but read the part that's in white, as we together, if you've been here the last 5 weeks, hopefully this will remind you what each week we talked about. If you weren't here, the part in yellow will hopefully just give you a little synopsis of what we've looked at. But let's read the part in white. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. The first talk that we had or teaching was the no other gods before me. When we realize that God has a claim on us. God says, I took you out of the land of Egypt. God says to you and I take you out of your sin. God has a claim on us. Like we tend to think we have claims on our kids or on our spouse when you get married because you put the ring on. There's sort of a claim there. God says, no, I have a bigger claim on your life. When we understand that and put first things first, life flows much easier. The second one, we should not have any idols. We need to let God be God. We are all created in God's image. Third one, don't misuse the Lord's name. Don't swear. The reality is, if you've taken the name Christian, you have a family name. I don't want to drag the name Van Hukelum through the mud. I'm proud of my name. If you take the name Christian, hopefully you're proud of that name. Why would we want to drag our family name through the mud? Then the Sabbath day. The idea that, yes, we have a Sabbath day, we're called to observe it, and yet the reality is 24/7 is sacred to God. It's not just a Sunday morning from 10 to 11:15, but 24/7 is sacred to God. Let's continue reading the last 6. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's anything. That's right. Don't covet anything of your neighbor. It's interesting. Well, last week we talked about honoring your parents, and honoring simply means to obey, to be in submission, to respect, to have attention to give loyalty to love, and to have patience. That's a lot we're called to do with our parents, right? It's a lot we're called to do, and yet our God calls us to that. But it's interesting. It's interesting to me, and it hit me this past week as I was reading all these. You know, if you look at number 5, and you got to remember, the first 4 of the 10 Commandments deal with our vertical relationship between us and God. The next 6 deal with that horizontal between each other. Forms a cross. Well, the first one of dealing with each other, of honor your father and mother. You know, if you're dishonoring today, you can learn to honor tomorrow. Maybe you've had fights with your parents in the past, or even we talked about last week, this also deals with how we treat our children. Parents, don't cause your children anger to become upset with you in their life. So to be honored as a parent, we need to be honorable. Well, if you and I are struggling with that, or if somebody in your family has maybe been dishonoring to you, or if you have been dishonoring, we can change that. Correct? We have another opportunity to change that. You shall not commit adultery. We're going to look at that next week. The reality is, if somebody has committed adultery, maybe you have walked that walk, or somebody you know has, or maybe your spouse has, there can be reconciliation. Because the event happened doesn't mean it needs to totally sever the relationship. Reconciliation can take place. You shall not steal. If I steal something from you, I have the opportunity to pay back restitution. I can pay you back for what I stole. You should not give false witness against your neighbor. You don't drag your neighbor's name through the mud. Well, if I gossip about somebody, it can be hard, but I can go back and love that person and ask for forgiveness. You should not covet your neighbor's anything. When we're coveting, and as we grow as a Christian within our faith, it can cause us to realize not to do that coveting, and we can change our behaviors. Out of all of these 6 that deal with that horizontal with our neighbors, there's only one. If we walk in that one, it can't be changed. You shall not murder. If I take somebody's life, that life is then gone. That life is taken. If I premeditate and take somebody's life, when that breath and that heartbeat of a person stops, that life, as we all know, that life is gone. I don't know about for you, but for me, when I realized that this past week, that 5 of these 6, God gives us, in some respects, a second chance. But this one, if we follow what the Old Testament is talking about, you shall not murder, once it's taken, there's done. Yes, there can be forgiveness. But we need to see, what does the word actually mean? So what we're looking at here is you shall not murder. The King James Version, how many of us, did a lot of you grow up with the King James Version? I know I did. And the King James Version actually says, you shall not kill. You shall not kill. That's the King James Version. The reality, the struggle with that translation is we have taken it, people have taken that word or this commandment, thou shalt not kill, and have moved it into the idea of war, have moved it into the idea of the death penalty. And what's interesting within Scripture, the word for war is a different Hebrew word. The idea of the death penalty, without really getting into it, the death penalty is talked about in the Old Testament and in the New Testament when the Apostle Paul talks about the government bearing the sword. Not in vain, but to keep peace of society. So when we look at the King James, when it says, thou shalt not kill, we've made it almost too big, and people have used it to say, well, we shouldn't be killing animals, and I think we need to have a humane treatment of animals. Yes, totally. And yet that's not what this commandment is getting at. The Hebrew word for thou shalt not murder actually is rasha, R-A-S-A-H, which means to kill, to murder, and to slay. And to murder, it's talking about, this word, Hebrew word, is talking about more of a premeditated